Hey everyone, this is Igor from vinousreverie. Welcome to another episode of everything you ever wanted to know about wine, but were afraid to ask. Today we're doing episode 5, and we'll discuss Riesling in all its glorious detail. My co-host Kevin Wink is going to join me in a minute, and he'll give a great overview about all Riesling and how it's itself differently in all different parts of the world, but how it's a great wine and great grape. So he's about to join us right now. Hey, Kevin, how are you? Yeah. Here you go, Kevin.
Can you see me?
Yeah, so I think it was frozen for a second. It happens, once in a while, so it's no big deal. But I think we're good to go.
We're in a cold spell here. We're freezing right now in California.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
Unfortunately, my head looks a little too big. I'm going to get a little further away from this. I haven't been drinking too much Riesling. Riesling does not cause your head to swell. If that's another myth that we need to bust, Riesling does not cause your head to swell. Your head does not end up looking like this after drinking Riesling, okay? He still looks normal.
Well, I think, well, Kevin, you look fantastic. And this is episode number 5, so I think all our legionnaires, our fans, they were asking what was the delay here a couple of weeks that we haven't seen any new episodes. So I think we're doing an episode right now. And I'm assuming you're drinking Riesling, which is the first episode where you're drinking wine, and I'm assuming it's because you really like it.
Well, I do love Riesling, and I have 25 of them in my portfolio from actually 6 different regions. And that's an interesting thing we're going to talk about, too, in terms of the different ways that Riesling expresses itself, according to the minerality of, where the vineyards are for it. But interestingly enough, tonight I'm sipping on one of your new purchases, which is the Ventoux Blanc. Yeah, in fact, to tell you how good that Ventoux Blanc is, this was Corvined a week ago, to taste with a few clients, and it just tastes spectacular tonight, after having been Corvined a week ago. And the Ventoux Blanc is from Southern Rhone. I'm not trying to give people a sales pitch on this, but it's a very fun blend of 3 white Southern Rhone grapes, which are Claret, Roussanne, and Vermentino. Yeah. And it's grown on the very minerally, granite-laden slopes of Mont Ventoux. And again, we're going to get into the minerality of how that expresses itself in wines, with the Rieslings. But, this is sort of Riesling-like, because, you've got all this granite on Mont Ventoux, and, the wine just sort of like, just bursts in your mouth with all these flavors and refreshing minerality and all that. And that's definitely true of Rieslings as well.
Oh, but while you're at it, you're right. So yeah, it's a wine that I just picked up from you last week. So can you give us an overview, maybe the producer? You mentioned the grapes, and it's a Claret-based wine, which is very unusual to find wine where Claret is the biggest percentage of the blend. So yeah, can you give us a little overview? Because I think it's a fantastic wine, and it's a great value, because I sell it for $15, and I think it's spectacular for the price point.
Yeah, this is a good example of the kinds of producers that I find in Europe. Most of them don't speak any English, and so I had to learn 4 languages to be able to do this effectively. But this is a producer whose family has owned vineyards on Mont Ventoux for about 150 years. Ironically, another interesting fact about a lot of my producers is they ended up with vineyard parcels that somebody else thought were useless. And they're about halfway up Mont Ventoux. And at the time, people thought, oh, you don't want to be that high up on the mountain. The grapes won't get ripe, and it's too hard to get up to the vineyards to work the vineyards. And what this family has actually benefited from for all these years is all of the minerality that is in their vineyard parcels that high up in the mountains. And that's true of Rieslings as well. I mean, it's like you look at these steep hillsides in Germany where they're growing these vines, and you're like, oh my God, you're crazy. Well, no, you're not crazy, because the vine roots sink down into all those rocky soils and pull up all these interesting flavor characteristics. And frankly, that's just as true on, the upper slopes of Mont Ventoux as it is whether in the Rheingau or in the Moselle. But for the Ventoux producer, all organic farming, all natural fermentation, so you're getting the pure natural expression of the grapes. And frankly, I think, with no exceptions, it's actually true about my Riesling portfolio from both Germany and Alsace too. Every one of those wines is organically farmed and naturally fermented.
And just to kind of give people the perspective, Mont Ventoux is southeast France, southern Rhone. So in the vicinity of Château-du-Pape, which is kind of the most famous village for wine in that part of the wine world.
Yeah, so the mountain itself, is about 10 miles east of Châteauneuf-du-Pape. And, Châteauneuf-du-Papes are great wines. They're really fun, really rich, robust wines, but they're grown on flat farmland. Yeah. And fortunately, there is a lot of minerality in the soil that still exists in that flat farmland, of Châteauneuf-du-Pape. But, what I look for is, I like to cook, as everyone's heard before. Yeah. And fortunately, as I'm further away from the camera this time, I don't look as fat as I normally look. Yeah. But minerals love food. And again, that's going to be a theme as we get into the Rieslings too. So, with this particular producer from Mont Ventoux having vineyards about halfway up the mountain, it's actually the tallest mountain in southeastern France until you get to the Alps. I mean, the Alps are obviously a lot taller, but the top of Mont Ventoux was often the finish of a lot of stages of the Tour de France. Yeah. There's a steep hill climb up to the top of Mont Ventoux. And for anybody who's a cycling fan and, who's watched, past episodes of the Tour de France, you probably saw people doing the final climb up to the top of Mont Ventoux. Anywhere there's rocks, you're going to get fun and interesting wines. And frankly, you don't have to do much to them, because all those minerals in the soil are adding all these complex characteristics to the wines that make them just delightful to drink. Yeah. As you're enjoying it right now. Delightful to drink, yes. Back to the overall MythBusters theme that we've explored in various different ways. People are kind of mystified by Riesling. Yeah. And particularly in California, where the main perception of, okay, well, what white grapes are there? Oh, there's Chardonnay, there's Sauvignon Blanc. And the interesting thing about the two of those is they're very different. Mm-hmm. And the Sauvignon Blanc is more herbal, more acidic, but you have fans for that, given that everybody has a different palate. And Chardonnay is richer, more fuller bodied, and you have fans for that. So across the spectrum of what people prefer, in California anyway, people are either like, hey, I'm happy with Sauvignon Blanc, or I'm happy with Chardonnay. Yep. But people are growing other white grape varietals, in California. Some of them expressing themselves better, some of them expressing themselves, worse, frankly. But Riesling, in my opinion, needs minerals. In Northern California, although we have a perfect growing climate for growing grapes, frankly, unless you get up into the hills, there's not a lot of minerals. Most California vineyards are effectively on flat farmland. Mm-hmm. The minerals in the soil leached out long ago. And again, I do not want to trash California wines. I enjoy California wines. About a third of my wines personally are from California. But, you've got to do some things to California wines. You've got flat farmland, not a lot of minerality in the soil. So, a lot more new oak is typically used. A lot more is being done with cultured yeast, which, helps, put interesting flavors and aromas, into the wines. But in areas with much more minerality, you don't have to do that at all. You can just let the wines express themselves. And so people's, opinion of Riesling in California is either from they've tasted some California Rieslings, which frankly don't taste like much. I mean, it's a nice wine, it's pleasant, it's reasonably food friendly, but it just really doesn't fully express itself in California. Or they've tasted some sweet German Rieslings, and they've just decided, I'm not into sweet wines. This just isn't for me. Rieslings are all sweet from Germany. They're not, And some of the, really impressive Rieslings from Germany are the ones that are completely dry. The word for dry in Deutsch, is trocken.
Yeah.
So anytime you see a Riesling that says trocken, it is completely dry. And try some of those. They are profound. And the reason they're profound is another characteristic of Riesling is really good acidity. And some people might be afraid of that. It's like, oh, is this going to be sour? No, it's not. It's going to just make your taste buds come alive as you taste that acidity with each sip. And in addition to making your taste buds come alive as you taste that acidity with each sip, it makes anything you're eating other than beef. Rieslings don't go well with beef. A caveat there, do not try Rieslings with beef. But, aside from that, the very food-friendly nature of Rieslings is, fish, pork, veal, even fatty things. Although all that acidity in the Riesling goes great with fatty foods. Grill some pork or chicken sausages. Drink, open a bottle of Riesling. You're like, wow, this is really good.
Yeah.
And so, and then, a lot of more spicier, the rich fruit profile of Rieslings and the acidity in Rieslings goes great with spicier foods. It's like Asian stir fries, Indian curries.
Yeah.
It's just between the acidity, and if you get a somewhat sweeter Riesling, it just cuts through all the heat, from, sort of spicier Asian foods. And so, I think Rieslings are possibly the most food-friendly wine that exists. But the thing about, I don't like sweet wines, they have their place. As I described, any spicier foods. And we had a segment on, on what to pair with spicy or, hotter foods. And we touched on Rieslings in that segment. But just from the richness of the fruit in Riesling and the acidity, other than beef, you could probably drink them with anything.
So yeah, that's a pretty good overview. So what if we take it maybe back a little bit and concentrate maybe to start out with German wines? Can you kind of explain to us the ripeness of Riesling versus the dry levels of Riesling? Because they're not the same. There's similarity, but they're not really the same concepts.
Yeah, and this is actually something else that I think inhibits people's appreciation or willingness to explore with Riesling, because there's some complex terms in this. To begin with, there's the perception of, aren't those German Rieslings sweet?
Yes.
Not necessarily. Sweetness relates to how much of the sugar you decide to ferment out during the fermentation process.
Yeah.
But adding to the confusion of this is some common wine terms in Germany that relate to the level of sugar in the grapes at the time of harvest. And the three most common are Cabernet, which has the lowest level of residual sugar, although it's still slightly sweet. Then Spätlese, Spät in Deutsch is late, and so Spätlese, Spät is later than Cabernet. The later you pick it, the higher levels of residual sugar in the wine. And Auslese which means it's beyond that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so beyond, after those, you have even longer, hang times, which produce even more sugars in the grapes, such as, Beeren Auslese, it's Beeren is berry, and aus, means, berries picked later.
Yeah.
Trockenbeeren Auslese. Trocken sounds like, well, isn't that dry?
Yes.
No, Trocken refers to dried out berries.
Yeah.
Because they've hung on the vines for so long.
Yes.
But those have, incredibly concentrated sugars in them that make very, very sweet wines. And some of the German sweet, very late harvest wines are some of the most expensive in the world.
Yeah.
And I mean, you have, Trockenbeeren Ausleses that are incredibly sweet and perfumed in terms of all their aromas from allowing the grapes to dry, selling for $200, $300 a bottle, and I mean, they're just incredibly delightful wines. Yeah. But, my focus, is not on things like $200 and $300 bottles of wine. It's fun, everyday drinking wines. And that's what you can find in Riesling. I already touched on just how food friendly they are and how versatile they are, with food. But the basic terms that relate to the amount of residual sugar in the grapes at time of harvest, Cabernet, Spätlese, and Auslese, do not necessarily correspond to the amount of residual sugar after fermentation. And there's fascinating things that interesting German vignerons, or they're not vignerons in Germany, it's Germany. They're vignerons in France. That's some other country, somewhere else. I don't know. I forget what they're called in Germany. But one of the most fascinating wines in my portfolio that literally sold out in a month, was the Spätlese. So it was picked at much higher levels of sugar, and then the producer fermented it to being completely dry. So you had all this richness from the really high levels of sugar at picking, and then he ferments all that sweetness out of it, and you're left with all this incredibly complex, rich fruit. And so it's very interesting what you can do with Riesling in terms of what sugar levels you pick it at, and then how you then subsequently ferment it. Yeah, and that adds to the overall complexity and fun of Rieslings in general. I do not want to trash Chardonnay. I mean, Chardonnay is a great food-friendly wine, and very pleasant to sip on, very pleasant to drink. But frankly, it's kind of one-dimensional. Mm-hmm. Until you start, adding complexity to it with new oak barrels or cultured yeast. Chardonnay, regardless of where it's grown, kind of tastes the same. Riesling is totally different. One of the principles behind my overall import portfolio is I do not want competition within the portfolio. And, I look at other importers, they go into Piedmont, Italy, and sign up 8 different producers. So they've got, 8 different Barolo producers in their portfolio. I just don't get the point of that. It's like you're competing with each other in terms of people you've signed up. It's like, your customers, aren't going to want to have 8 different Barolos from one importer in their retail shop. Yeah. And so I normally, do not ever represent more than one producer in a region. One exception of that for me is a region in Germany called Pfalz. That's PFALZ. And I have 2 producers in Pfalz, 20 miles apart, one in the more northern area of Pfalz where there's significant limestone deposits, the other in the more southern area of Pfalz where there's more volcanic deposits and more granite, and it's a little bit more clay in the soil. And the 2 wines are completely different. The ones from the northern part of Pfalz where there's the limestone, you've got the same sort of refreshing minerality like you might get in a Sancerre or a Chablis, where these just burst the flavors in your mouth. And then from the southern side of Pfalz, you get all this deeply flavored, rich fruit from these deposits of volcanic volcanic components, some granite and some clay, and then in other German regions, the main rock in the soil in regions like the Rheingau and the Moselle with very steep vineyards sloping down to a river is slate. And slate, you get this sort of like deep penetrating flavors on your mid palate.
Hey, can we for a second? Because I think you mentioned a couple of things. So I want to kind of go back to the ripeness versus dryness levels. So I think one thing you were talking about is that for Spätlese, for example, it has more ripeness than a Cabernet, but so it's could be sweeter. But sometimes you can have a Spätlese Trocken, which is where you ferment out the sugars and it becomes a drier style wine. So I think that's what kind of you were relating to. So sometimes you can take a riper grape, but make it in a drier style.
Yeah, and you get the really rich fruit of that riper grape.
Yes.
And see, this is why you can do this with Riesling.
Yeah.
There's always high acidity.
Yes.
And so even if you let that grape stay longer on the vine and get riper and have high levels of sugar or higher levels of sugar in it, Riesling maintains that acidity.
Yeah.
If you let Chardonnay, stay on the vine too long, you lose all the acidity.
Yes.
With Riesling, you don't.
Yeah.
And because the Riesling grape itself has higher levels of acidity, which stays throughout the growing cycle. And that's what's fascinating, about Riesling, particularly with the Moselle Rieslings.
Yeah.
On one hand, I can understand that somebody says, "Oh, sweet wines, I don't like them." Hey, if that's the case, that's fine. I accept that. But the Moselle Rieslings, if you can get past the sweetness of a lot of them, you start appreciating all this just precise acidity that just cuts through anything that you're eating and just accentuates the flavors of whatever you're eating.
Well, just like you were saying. So one of the things that I've heard, comparing Chardonnay and Riesling, is that Chardonnay is kind of the winemaker's wine. Basically, the winemaker could manipulate it at will, whereas the Riesling is the wine of the soil. The winemaker cannot manipulate Riesling because I think what you're related to is that it transposes the minerals that's in it. And you were talking about the Falls region, which got some volcanic activity there, versus obviously the Moselle, which is famous for its slate soils.
Yeah. And I may rephrase what you just said.
Yes.
Is the winemakers in these regions in Germany, they don't want to do anything.
Yes.
Because they know that doing nothing creates a really interesting, expressive wine.
Yeah.
And the Rheingau, which is less well known than the Moselle, but it's a region, that's about 30 miles west of Frankfurt, where the Rhine, which people normally think of as a south to north river, turns west for 15 miles. And you have vineyards on the north side of the river. So you've got perfect south-facing sun exposure on this 15-mile stretch, of the Rhine. In addition, I have a fun picture on my website of the sun reflecting off the Rhine, and reflects up through the vineyards.
Yeah.
Other than some places in New Zealand where people have planted vineyards on the south side of lakes, this is a really rare phenomena, in terms of where vineyards are located.
Yeah.
And so, another, thing that people, look at in terms of Germany, they think, oh, it's too far north, it's cold, the grapes won't get ripe. And we'll get into that in a minute in terms of the characteristics of the Moselle wines, because there's some truth to that, frankly, in the Moselle. But in the Rheingau, which is just as far north as the Moselle, you've got all this sunlight hitting the Rhine all day long and reflecting up in the vineyards.
Yeah.
And so the vineyards obviously have the sunlight from above, and then it also hits all this dark slate that's in the vineyards, which reflects up, but you also have the sun reflecting up off the water through the vineyards. And that is what makes the really powerful and expressive wines from the Rheingau, as opposed to the sort of more delicate, nuanced wines from the Moselle.
And can you kind of go a little bit more into details? Delicate, you mean like lower alcohol, like feather light in their precision in the Moselle versus there's more, I guess, weight to the Rieslings from the Rheingau. If you could give a better description of that.
Yeah, the Moselle. If you look closely at the map,
Yes,
you would wonder, oh my God! I mean, how did a river ever develop this course?
yes.
I mean, there's like 40 of these tight loops and turns in the Moselle within about a 30-mile stretch.
Yeah.
And they're trying to put vineyards wherever they can, mainly on the north slope of the river. But it's this very steep V-shaped valley. Let me see if I can do that. Yeah, my hands are closer together here. And frankly, a lot of these vineyard locations in the Moselle, even when you're trying to locate them on the north slope of the river, they only get about maybe 4 or 5 hours a day of effective sunlight. And so I realized as we were thinking about this episode, I thought to myself, do I actually know why the style in the Moselle was to make sweeter wines? And I thought no, I don't. I've always enjoyed Moselle wines, but I realized, well, why did this style develop? And from having been there in person, and I have driven the entire river from Koblenz to Trier, and if you go up to the motorway, that's up on the flatlands above the river, it's about 45 minutes from Koblenz to Trier. If you go down to the river valley and go every loop and turn, it's about 6 hours. And so the thought I have as to why this style developed, I already talked about, regardless of how late you let the Riesling grapes hang on the vine, they retain acidity, is that in all these twists and turns of the river where somebody was trying to still grow grapes, they probably didn't get all that right. And so you just let them still grow as long as you could before you're worried about frost, and would eventually pick them, and they had higher sugar levels.
Yeah. Go ahead. Well, it's funny that you mentioned that because Jessis Robinson, she has in the mid-90s, she did like wine courses. I don't know if you ever seen that. And she did like 10 episodes dedicated to the major grapes of the world. And then obviously one of them was Riesling. And in the Riesling episode, she was talking with Ernest Lucen. You're probably familiar. He's one of the...
Yeah, Dr. Lucen.
Yes, Dr. Lucen. Yeah, I think people who drink... that's a wine that's sold in a lot of even like big box stores. He's kind of entry-level wine, not his more spectacular, like vineyard level wines. But it was a fantastic episode, and he was actually alluding to what you're just talking about. He was basically saying that in the 1950s, the Moselle was more than half its current size. So it used to be on I guess on the southwest side. That's where the prime vineyards are. But they decided to expand the Moselle into that northern territory and the more of the flatter lands. So I kind of diluted the product. And one of the examples he was saying is that the famous southwest facing slopes, you need one person to pick a hectare of a vineyard of wine from the vineyards of grapes. And basically on the northern side, you could do a machine could do 10 acres. So it's the slopes are different. Here on the south side, you could only manually pick the grape versus machine harvest. So basically, they were kind of trying to get the bigger producers. They were using this concept of like, oh, let's just make the wine as cheaper as possible, and we still put Moselle on it. So they were kind of diluting the product. And I think it's almost related to the episode that we did about the myth of total wine. That's how the big box stores and the grocery stores, that's the products they're getting from the same way in California, where they're getting a lot of the wines from the Central Valley, where it's a very fertile land, but not great land for grapes. So they're trying to scale it up to have like the cheapest product possible and basically dilute the marketplace.
Yeah, I'm not certain of what I'm about to say, but I think the German regulations are now prohibiting that. One of the German regulations are pretty strict, and most of them relate to yields per acre. Mm-hmm. And so I think in the Moselle, they strictly regulated what the yields per acre now can be.
Yeah.
And so the people that thought, oh, well, we can, farm on this flat farmland, up on the plateau above the river, I don't think those producers can call their wines Moselle.
Yeah.
It's just Deutscher, it's a Deutscher wine or something like that, at this point. But, the Moselle, as pretty as it is, I've been there on summer days where, frankly, it feels cold. And I don't know, if that, is what has resulted in what was the original style, in the Moselle of, just the, lower alcohol, and slightly sweet wines, and because you have to let them hang longer on the vine to reach phenolic ripeness, or what it is. I should find out about that, frankly. But the Moselle wines are these very perfumed, nuanced wines. I think that they are equally food friendly as the other Rieslings from the Rheingau, from Pfalz, and in fact that's what's fascinating. You've got the four main regions in Germany producing Riesling, from Moselle to the Rheingau to the Rhine-Hessen to Pfalz, that you've got completely different wines from the same grape. Mm-hmm. And from not a very large geographic area. Oh, aside from that, you've got a region that's not represented in my portfolio called the Nahe. That's Nahe. You got the little umlauts above the A, which you pronounce it Nahe instead of Na.
Yeah.
And that I just haven't found a producer that I'm happy with yet. In the Nahe, but that's more granite.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, there's some slate in the Nahe, but it's a fairly steep river valley. This is roughly between the Moselle and the Rheinhessen, and a little bit of a remote area, not well known. But there's actually a very, very prestigious producer that probably everybody knows the name of, even if they don't know the exact region, and that's Donhoff. In the Nahe, whose wines are frankly very, very expensive.
Yeah, it's definitely a famous producer. And you were talking about the floral aspect of the Moselle wines, because I'm having a Riesling, so I'm having the Urziger Wirtsgarten Spätlese, which is like a famous vineyard in the Moselle. You're probably familiar with that.
In fact, that's interesting, because that is possibly my favorite vineyard in the Moselle. The aromatics out of the Urziger Wurzgarten. Wurz is spicy.
Yes.
Garten is garden, so it's spice garden.
Yeah.
And that tells you it's very funny names on all these vineyards. They sound exotic, and they're actually very basic. But the Wurzgarten, you get all these spicy, just expressive aromatics out of the Wurzgarten vineyard in Urzig. Yeah. And, adjectives that ER at the end. So when you see Urziger, it is from the town of Erzig, but that's a description. Can you still see me? There's this weird circle.
Well, we see that. Yeah, you're kind of like frozen, but we still hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's probably better than having to see me too. Yeah, and yeah. So if you see Erziger, it's from the town of Erzig. If you see Grocker,
yes, it's
from the town of Grock. If you see Bernkasteller, it's from the town of Bernkastel. Because ER is the ending that makes a German word into an adjective.
Well, they'll have a producer's name, and this one is called Urziger Wurzgarten Riesling Spätlese. So it's the village, the vineyard, obviously the grape, and the ripeness level of the style of the wine. So,
yeah, in fact, this is almost similar to some of the names of Italian wine grapes, which sound exotic, and they're basically very just common everyday terms. But another term or another vineyard name you'll see in the Moselle is Treppchen. Yeah. Oh, doesn't that sound cute? Treppchen. Yeah. Well, Treppchen Trepp is a staircase.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that shows the steepness of these Moselle vineyards. And Chen is an affectionate diminutive. So it's like Erdener.
Yeah.
It's from Erden, which is another mile, down the river from Erzig.
Yeah.
Erdener Treppchen. It's the Erden staircase. This very, very steep vineyard in Erden. But you can look all up and down the Moselle, and there's Treppchen vineyards in every little town, up and down the Moselle.
So you're saying that basically to us, it sounds like a lot of like exotic, romantic type of names, but the way you're describing it is just a typical efficient German name.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to walk up the stairs, and you talked about the yields. I mean, it's like, these are really hard vineyards to work. And I mean, they're very steep. I mean, the typical vineyards in the Moselle are at least 30% slopes or 30-degree slopes. And some of them top out at 60 degrees.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about an angle like this. Yeah. I mean, you're down at the river level and looking up at this thing, and you're like, oh my God, how do they even farm these things? Yeah. And with those, with that slope, one thing that happens in the winter rains, an essential part of these vineyards is the slate. We already talked about the northern position of Germany, like, oh, the grapes don't get ripe. But what helps the grapes get ripe is the slate, which is dark in those vineyards that absorbs sunlight during the day and reflects up through the vines, all evening. Well, here's what happens in the Moselle all winter during the rains. The rains, cause a lot of slate to, slide down the vineyards down to basically the bottom. Yeah. And every spring, there's work crews that go and collect all that slate. Yeah. And walk up these Treppchens, yeah. These little staircases, and redeposit that slate in the vineyards. Yeah. This is one of the most labor-intensive areas to grow grapes in the world.
Yeah, if you watch some YouTube videos or just images, it's spectacular. And Kevin, what you're saying, I think it'd be fun to have episodes just on these regions individually, because I think they're so rich in character. And Riesling is my favorite grape. I'm not even sure what's second best, but tasting them would be a lot of fun. I think maybe we could do an episode on some of these regions in more detail. What do you think we kind of maybe wrap it up with Alsace, the other famous region?
I feel terrible. Yeah, I've neglected Alsace. So if you ask a German, Alsace is part of Germany, but we're not going to get into that. But It is Alsace is separated from the rest of France by a mountain range, the Vosges.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Alsace is bordered on the west by the Rhine, and between the Rhine and the ridge to the west of Alsace, the top of the Vosges mountain range is only a stretch of about 20 or 25 miles. And then you've got this almost impenetrable forest on the west side of the Vosges, where, frankly, I mean, Alsace legitimately, is part of Germany. I'm not going to get into the geopolitical things going on here, but, my Alsace supplier, I mean, he speaks German more than French, and I mean, but what you have in Alsace is really interesting for an expression of Riesling.
Mm-hmm.
The Vosges is mainly granite, and so from all these granite, infused vineyards in Alsace, you get these incredibly pure, precise, expressions of Riesling. It's fun and interesting, in Germany to have all the different, expressions depending on, in addition to the slate, whether there's mica or whether there's quartz, or down closer to the river, whether you have more loam or loess and all that. But in Alsace, you get this just full expression of all this granite, which just, I mean, you taste these Rieslings and they just burst with flavor in your mouth from the, the purity and the precision. It's like going hiking and stopping by this mountain stream, and you taste this refreshing, pure mountain water that is also, typically infused with granite. And so Alsace is also just a really significant producer of, just outstanding Rieslings. And Alsace is this sort of like, almost obscure netherworld out there somewhere in France. And I think, people don't fully appreciate the wonderful wines that come from the region. But, another interesting thing about Riesling is, there's a reasonable amount of Riesling grown in Italy, in the, northern alpine regions of Italy.
Yes.
And, why? Well, because you've got the same things. You've got all this granite from the Alps, in Italy. It's a great place to grow Riesling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so, unfortunately, as I described earlier, a lot of people's initial exposure to Riesling is they think, oh, this is a new grape I should try. They try some California Rieslings and they kind of go, not really. It's just not very interesting. And I agree with them. It's not. But if you get to areas with higher levels of minerality, whether it's the slate from the Moselle or the Rheingau, or the limestone from the northern part of Pfalz, or the granite and volcanic deposits from the southern part of Pfalz, or the granite from Alsace, these are truly wonderful, just fascinating wines.
Like I said, Kevin, I think we should tackle one of these regions. I would love to do a whole episode on Alsace. I love the wines from Alsace, even though it's for some unapparent reason, maybe people don't know about them. A lot of aromatic wines beyond Riesling, and just like beautiful expressions of these wines. But just to wrap it up, I think it's a great overview of Riesling, and I think it's like maybe just like an entry level overview. I think you could talk for hours about Riesling. But Alta Adige, you were mentioning in the Alps. Austria makes some great Rieslings. There's good Riesling from Oregon and from the Finger Lakes in New York State. Australia and New Zealand make great Rieslings. In fact, New Zealand, from what I've read, makes some really high-class Rieslings, some of them comparable to the great German Rieslings that are not imported into the U.S. So the consumer, mostly they import Pinot Noir and obviously Sauvignon Blanc. That's what New Zealand is known for. So that's a brief overview. I hope you guys had fun. I'm not sure, Kevin, if you're still with us, but it was a great episode. Yeah,
I'm still with you. I haven't passed out. Yeah, my glass is still upright. I'm not like this. I haven't gone like, yeah.
Well, haven't had enough wine yet. But I'll be enjoying this Riesling after this episode. Once again, Kevin, thank you for this overview, and I think we'll have a fun show next time.
Cool. Thank you very much, Igor, and good night to everybody who joined, and thank you.
Thank you, guys. Good night.
Okay, bye.
Bye.